Hello and welcome to episode 32 of the Adamola Bookman podcast. My name's Al Bond and I'm here with my co-host John Coughlin. Hi, Johnny.
Hi, Al. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks. And this week we're doing the greatest comeback, the Béla Guttman story.
Yeah, from Genocide to Football Glory by David Bolchover.
2 weeks ago, Johnny, we were sat here and reading about how poor Martin Keown had been discriminated against because he was from Oxford, and sometimes people would mock his accent and tread on his toes. Yeah, puts that in perspective, doesn't it?
A little bit, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is not only a football biography, it's actually a treatise on anti-Semitism in Europe in the 20th century, basically, isn't it?
Yeah, this is what Bolchover does is he uses Guttman's travels, and Guttman went everywhere, to talk about how Jews were treated in different parts of Europe and South America. And my God, it's heavy stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And this isn't a political podcast, Johnny, and I don't want it to be a political podcast because that's the whole point. But it really puts a lot of this in perspective. Hey, look at all these people. Nazis are funny, aren't they? No, they're not, man. Just read the book. It's just so hideous. It's so hideous. Yeah. But yeah, it is as much, a story about European Jews in the 20th century as it is about Béla Guttman. In fact, every chapter is preceded with a story about the mistreatment of Jews throughout the last 1,000 years in Britain, in Europe, sorry. And it's a hard read, Johnny, isn't it?
Yeah, the way in Britain you just learn about the Second World War and maybe, I don't know, Isaac Newton, just the kind of good things that you did in the course of history. The Irish history books are very much about, how we had such a tough time, from you guys, which I guess you don't learn about. But in terms of the Jewish story, what do you learn in school? The Bible stuff, obviously. We would have done the Dreyfus Affair and the Second World War, which is obviously the nadir of this entire Jewish story in Europe. But my God, there's so many parts that I guess are just totally, not covered or totally whitewashed.
Well, that's it, brother. I mean, you say it's from nadir, but basically it's just a continuation, isn't it? I must confess I knew nothing about the White Revolution in 1919 in Hungary. I didn't know anything about that.
Yeah, but even going back to when he went, so what Bolchover does is just say Guttman goes to Argentina or to Brazil. The first part of the book will be about the history of the treatment of Jewish people, or a particular incident in and around the time Guttman was there, or a historical incident in that country. And the stuff in Portugal, crikey, man. In the 1500s, like thousands of Jews being killed there. Just every turn, and like you say, I guess it puts a lot into perspective. But you're right, the idea is not to be a political podcast, but it's hard to gloss over when you've just read the book. But yeah, in terms of I would say it's the book that I learned most from.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
And this is a topic that I have read about. Simon Cooper has done a book called Ajax, the Dutch, the War, which is about Ajax's. There's this idea that Ajax is a Jewish club and the role that football played in the Second World War. And I read Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, which goes across Europe, outlining how Jews were treated in different countries, including in Hungary and Romania, countries described in this book. That's the book where this idea of the banality of evil comes from. So I have I have read some of this stuff before, but this was really something. It was shocking in parts,
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it's horrible. Okay, but let's get it back on course. All right, so I always ask you this at the start. Before we read the book, Johnny, what did you know about Béla Guttman?
Literally nothing.
I mean, I was familiar with the curse of Béla Guttman, the Benfica curse, which we'll get onto. Spoiler alert, it's bollocks. And I got him confused with Bela Lugosi, the 30s actor who used to play Frankenstein and Dracula. But yeah, I didn't know a great deal about him. So very quickly to put it into context, Béla Guttman was a Hungarian Jew who was born in 1899. So he's by far the oldest of any of the footballers we've covered.
Guttman is part of this Hungarian story, and it's huge and outsized influence in the development of football in the first half of the century, from the 20s and the 30s into the 50s, with that golden generation and the Puskás team. And maybe part of the story that wasn't so much touched upon in the Puskás book was the role played by Hungarian Jews in particular. And it really is quite something, isn't it, in this book? At every point, it's like, oh yeah, the manager of Real Madrid, that was a Jewish guy. You know, the other, like he's managing in Benfica, the manager of whoever Sporting, oh, that was a Jewish guy, he's over in Argentina. Huge influence. And I suppose one of the broader themes of the book is how there was this massive Jewish interest and involvement in the development of football. And then it was just totally wiped out in the Second World War. And I suppose, you know, he played for this team, we'll get onto it, Hako All-Stars, which was a Jewish team in Vienna. And they were huge, and they would travel around Europe. They went to the Middle East to play in Tel Aviv, they played in Egypt, they went to the US, and they went to South America, and they would get huge numbers, largely of Jewish football fans. But that team was, you know, shut down during the Nazi era, and it just never came back. So there's this, it's really quite incredible, isn't it? Because I suppose in a way the story you think about in the Second World War, and like, it's that Stalin thing, isn't it? Where they say, you know, whatever, one killing is a crime and 10,000 killings is a statistic. 6 million Jews were killed in the Second World War, but really, what does that mean to anyone, really? It's just incomprehensible, right? But this, I suppose, kind of lays out in parts the story in this part and that part and this part, and it's just really, really shocking. I found that particular part of the book, the Jewish role in football, really interesting.
Well, that's it. It's been erased. I mean, pre the Second World War, Jewish footballers and Jewish managers were a huge part of European football, and that seems to be totally forgotten. David Bolchover talks about how Béla Guttman has been forgotten in his own country. And anecdotally, Johnny, listeners may remember that I go to a coffee shop which has a Hungarian lady, lovely G. When we went in to talk about Puskás, you should have seen her little face light up. She was so excited that I was doing Ferenc Puskás as a player. I brought this in and said, I'm doing another Hungarian player, Béla Guttman. She'd never heard of him. Never heard of him. And I think that's true. That whole history has been erased for the people of Hungary.
That's something, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the only Jewish manager to ever win the European Cup.
Anyway, let's just get into the book. Yeah, this is not a funny book.
Fortunately, I've managed to highlight some funny moments. Yeah, there was a massive gear change right at the start of the book. He's talking about the horrors of the Holocaust and the horrors of the Jewish oppression. And then he cites, the person he cites is Ian Dowie. Ian Dowie, who coined the phrase bounce backability. And honestly, it took my breath away. I was reading about this and I was like, yeah, all of a sudden there's fucking Ian Dowie's ugly mug on the page. It's like, bloody hell. But yeah, the author describes him as having the most bounce back ability of any footballer or managers ever. And yep, coming back from a Holocaust, yeah, that is bounce back ability, isn't it? That's not coming back from a late defeat, is it? No.
Yeah,
there's a couple of funny people cited. Another time, and certainly this will be amusing to Forest fans such as myself, Gary Birtles' name pops up. Fuck off, Birtles. What are you doing here? Believe you me, Birtles has no place in a book like this.
Let's talk about Guttman then. So, as you say, he was born in 1899. He's from Hungary. Like, the backdrop, just murder, pogroms, is just constant backdrop to this book. Starting with the White Terror, which you referred to there, which is an anti-Semitic pogrom following the collapse of a short-lived communist government in Hungary after the First World War. So that's the kind of milieu, the setting for the book.
He's the son of two dancers, and this is something, he seems to set up a dancing school wherever he goes, all over the world. dancing is a big part. Although it would be true to say you never really learn a great deal about Béla Guttman's character, do you?
We've had this in a few of the kind of more historic books, I think. But it's hard for the author to make the person come alive, I think, just because it's so long ago and there's probably such a little record. In case of Guttman, there's probably very little record, you know. But yeah, I felt the same. We kind of have a fairly broad outline of his character.
Yeah, and then you have to sort of judge him by his actions. And there's genuinely some breathtaking moments towards the end of the book. Like, it's like, oh, I see. You're that kind of guy. Yet he is a very, very interesting character whom it is very, very difficult to know because, as you say, there's no recorded images of him talking, are there? I don't think there's any records of him speaking whatsoever. It's just pictures and the occasional quote here and there and a few quotes from colleagues. And what's more, I mean, so many of his colleagues pre-war were killed in the Holocaust. So there's very little to go on here. His
own experiences in the Holocaust were shrouded in mystery, and it's not something he spoke about publicly. And I think that the author must have done a lot of research for this book, because, yeah, he's kind of chasing a bit of a ghost, isn't he?
Well, he is. I mean, if you read up about Béla Guttman beyond this book, the number one point of reference is this book. There's not much else to read about him. There's apparently he did an autobiography back in the 50s, 60s, but there's no trace of that at all.
Jonathan Wilson is quoted quite a bit in this, both because he's written about Hungarian football and he's written, obviously, the inverting the pyramid. But in that one about the Hungarian football, the preface, he's trying to find this fella, the grave of this guy, Isidor Herschel. And this guy shows up in this book, but he was another Jewish Hungarian coach who went to South America. And I guess Wilson starts the book with him because he sees him as really being so significant in starting this kind of tactical revolution in South America, if you want. But he's in this book as well. He's the guy, Al, in the book who got a job with Hakoah All-Stars when they were touring South America as a masseuse and somehow parlayed that into becoming the manager of River Plate. Like he was a crook, essentially.
Yeah, absolute con man. Yeah, that's it. But yeah, it was a sponge, right? Totally absorbed everything that was put in front of him and then used it well.
You mentioned he's from Hungary, and himself and his brother were dance teachers as well as footballers. But he played most of his playing career for these Jewish teams. MTK was I think the name of it was the Jewish Exercise Activists Club.
Strong name.
Yeah, which was a team in Budapest. And he left that eventually for Hakoah Vienna, which became Hakoah All-Stars. And these are Jewish teams with predominantly Jewish players. So most of his friends and teammates, as you say, died in the Holocaust because he played in these overwhelmingly Jewish teams. The founder of Hakoah, this guy called Fritz Lohner Beda, was kicked to death in Auschwitz, like a week after his two daughters had been gassed in Minsk, in Belarus. And this is the thing, you know, football is kind of almost a backdrop, really, in the book, isn't it? Or it's kind of a device. It's kind of a device that he uses it's quite clever. He uses it as a device to tell a much bigger, deeper story.
Yeah, he absolutely does. As I say, it's only half really about Béla Guttman, this book. Yeah, so he goes on to play for this, Hakoah All-Stars, who go on to be known as Hakoah Vienna.
The other way around.
Is that right? This Bolchover says is one of the most significant football teams in the history of all football, and now really there's almost no trace of them. And I cannot stress this Hakoah All-Stars team. This was not a team that was ashamed of their identity. They wore a white and blue shirt with a massive great Star of David on the front. I mean, it was It's a beautiful looking kid, isn't it? There's a picture that one of the earliest pictures is of Béla Guttman in 1925 wearing that Hakoah kit. And you know, Johnny, that I'm going to say he looks like he's 60 years old in this picture. It's absolutely wild. He was born at the age of 40.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a picture of him. But in this magnificent kit, he's got this funny little hat on as well. He looks fabulous, but he looks super, super old. But yeah, you can only imagine the kind of antipathy this team, this unapologetically Jewish team, must have conjured up amongst the anti-Semites in these countries of the time.
He also went to play in the US. So Guttman, they went on a tour, and Guttman essentially just stayed in America and played for a New York Hakoah. Another big surprise was football was very popular in America in the 1920s.
Yeah. It's incredible. They say when Hakoah All-Stars played, Rothschild was there, weeping in the crowd.
Mm.
Yeah, it was an incredible thing. Apparently football was huge in America in the 1920s. He played for a team called Brooklyn Wanderers, which I have opinions on. And then he went on to play for a team called the New York Giants. Oh, come on, sports. There's so many names out there. There's so many names you can pick. As a businessman, he had taken on business interests in New York in the 20s, and inevitably he lost it all in the great crash of 1929.
He returned then to the US. He returned to Europe as like many Jews were trying to leave. He got essentially a US green card residence permit, so he could have stayed. And Guttman, he's a gutsy character, isn't he? He says, okay, I'm going to go back to Europe as everyone else is going, and there's Jews all over places like Austria and Hungary going in the other direction. But he went back.
He went back in 1932. He returned to Vienna, Hungary. And to Vienna, I was just astonished by that. Astonished. But then you don't know when it's going on, do you? You don't know. You're hearing things, but oh man.
So yeah, he's back there. He's in Austria in 1938 at the time of the Anschluss.
Yeah, he actually played for the Hungarian football team at the 1924 Olympics, which was then the equivalent of the World Cup. And here's a nice little tie-in with modern day football. He was also displeased with the facilities and the accommodation provided by the Hungarian FA, just like Roy Keane was. But he went one better than stick it up your bollocks, didn't he? I didn't respect you as a player and I don't respect you as a man. He nailed dead rats to the doors of the Hungarian FA. There's a way of getting your message across. This isn't the nicest hotel. I tell you what, spruce it up a bit of dead rat.
You know, in the Paris Olympics, the most recent one, in the Olympic Village, the beds for the athletes were designed in such a way that people couldn't have sex in them. They wouldn't support the weight of two people.
I would imagine Olympians are fairly flexible.
I'm sure they could have found an alternative, right?
Well, there's no bed, that's it. No sex. Can't have sex without a bed, Johnny. Everyone knows that.
Yeah. Anyway, okay. Where were we?
Yeah, so astonishingly gutsy move. Yeah, he returns from New York, where he was free to stay, to Eastern Europe in 1932.
He has a bad game one day and he says, fuck that, I'm retiring, and he just resigns. And then he actually got man of the match in the newspaper for this particular game. Yeah, he sounds like he mightn't have been the easiest character, Guttman.
No, I don't think he was an easy character at all.
He retires as a player and then he becomes a coach. He coaches Hakoah, and then he goes to coach FC Twente. They came within a two-legged playoff of winning the national championship, but they were beaten by Feyenoord and another Jewish manager, Robert Cohn, who had previously coached Barcelona and Bayern Munich, and there's a street named after him in Rotterdam. There's stuff like this all throughout the book. It's remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is astonishing how this has all been forgotten.
After returning to Europe in 1932, he's gone to Netherlands. And then he says, okay, I'm just going to go back to Hungary to manage Újpest. He replaced another Jewish manager who was fleeing to the US. Then he led this Újpest to this Metropa Cup, which is a kind of a precursor to the European, or to the Champions League. So it was a club competition with teams from Hungary, Italy, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. And this was because those were the teams that had performed well in the World Cups in 1934 and 1938. So that was a huge achievement. It's essentially like winning the European Cup before the European Cup existed. So they beat Inter Milan, and it had been renamed Ambrosiani Milan by Mussolini.
Is that his last job before the war?
Well, yeah. So, like, this guy, the owner, you'll remember this, Al, because it's one of the most striking stories in the whole book. The owner of Ujpest is a Jewish guy called Lipot Ashner. And he didn't renew Guttman's contract as the coach, but he kept him on as a kind of a scout for the first few years of the war. Hungary was allied with Nazi Germany, but it was actually invaded by the Nazis in 1944. So it was pretty rough for the first few years of the war, but it was only in 1944 when the annihilation of Hungarian Jews began. So he was working in Hungary throughout the first few years of the war. It's incredible. But this guy, Lipot Ashner, the owner of Ujpest, so when the Nazis invade Hungary in 1944, Eichmann came as part of the Nazi administration there. And he took over this guy Ashner's house. And Ashner was sent to Mauthausen concentration camp where he died.
So this is when the book enters into a little bit of speculation here, because actually nobody knows what Béla Guttman did to survive the war towards the end.
The author spoke with family members, right, who said that he was essentially living in his brother-in-law's attic for however long, for a period of months.
Yeah.
And the brother-in-law, so Guttman's wife's brother, future wife actually, kept them in this corner of the attic that was kind of obscured from the attic door. And if he ever went up to him, he used to bring a plank of wood and walk on the plank of wood so as not to upset the dust. And the Nazis came a few times and they stuck their head up into the attic. And there was whenever the dust hadn't been, there was no footprints in the dust. So they said, okay, so they just moved on.
Yeah, can you imagine? Can you imagine that situation? He ended up the war in a work camp, but it wasn't a death camp, essentially, right?
Yeah, it was a labour camp, but then a lot of people in that labour camp were sent to Auschwitz, but him and another footballer and an actor.
That sounds right.
And another person, I think there was 4 of them, they escaped, they fled.
Yeah, and as I say, this is speculation on the part of Bolchover. This is the best information we have, although none of it's absolutely, definitely 100%. As I mentioned before, in the 60s, he did release an autobiography, and it says there's over 80,000 words in this book, and how he survived the Second World War is summed up in 80 words, which is incredible, because why wouldn't he write about that? Why wouldn't he want to tell that story?
But Bolchover does try and explain it, that, we're looking at this from the perspective of, 80 years later. But there was a period there of, like Hungary, for example, was under communist rule for however long after the Second World War. But all across Europe, this was not something that people talked about for decades, according to Bolchover. So we're looking with a different perspective. People were essentially, like, there was, he talks about the reaction in the discussions in Austria post Second World War about
concerning reparations,
like giving property and money back to Jews, and then that failed because someone somewhere said, well, if we do that with the Jews, we'll have to give back things to the Nazis that they lost as well, which just seems so wild and insane now, but that's the world that Guttman was in. And I guess at the end of the day, Guttman was a survivor, and he wasn't just gonna, I don't know, maybe this is part of that as well, because this book is predominantly about the Jewish experience in Europe. It doesn't seem right to kind of like rush through these parts, but there is a whole story about football, which it kind of comes later, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It does. The second half of the book is more focused on football, and it's more focused on his career as a manager, which of course is what he's most famous for.
And it's probably more documented. It was probably a somewhat easier job. But anyway, in terms of his own personal story, it's the sister of this guy who had him in the attic. He married that guy's sister. In fact, he'd been seeing this sister. That's how he ended up in the attic in the first place. And they married after the war. And then he immediately went back to work. He went to work for Újpest and in Hungary. And then he went to work in Romania. And Romania, according to the author, was second only to Germany in the killing of Jews. And if you look at the numbers, Poland, because so many people were sent to Auschwitz, but Poland is very high. But according to the author, Romania was second only to Germany. And I did read elsewhere that where Romania was different, in Hungary, for example, the real Holocaust as such started when the Nazis took over Hungary. But Romania was a bit of an outlier in that it wasn't the Nazis who were... What happened in most countries was the Nazis worked through existing administrations, and that's how they killed Jews. But in Romania, it was actually the Romanian government. They didn't just go along with they didn't do what the Nazis were telling them. They just did it themselves.
Yeah. We've got through the war now. But yeah, I mean, we are always reminded. I mean, this is it, because football stadiums are often places of congregation for these groups as well. A lot of the places he would go on to play football were scenes where, where Jews were rounded up by. You cannot get away from it. And the author doesn't let you, does he? He doesn't let you. At every point, you're reminded of the atrocities committed.
I thought he did a really good job in that. I think he actually, while the book is really, really heavy, obviously, I think he did quite a good job. It wasn't, I thought he struck a good tone with that, It
was all relevant. None of it seemed...
it wasn't gratuitous or superfluous. It was all very relevant, and it's just so striking. It was amazing in terms of, we really know nothing, don't we?
No, we know nothing.
It was interesting when he went back to coach. Újpest, he was paid partially in food, and then he went to another team, Kispest, which we of course remember because that's where the great galloping major Puskás was, and he coached Puskás.
Yeah, well, I mean, he actually played a significant role in his career. I mean, he goes on to be manager of a Hungarian team in the 50s, right? And in one particular game as a fullback who was playing in a particularly unsporting way, and apparently Guttman was big on the being a sporting player, and so he tries to get him substituted. Puskás tells him not to go anywhere. Fucking he quits on the spot, right, and just bowls up to the stands and reads his newspaper. The merest hint of insubordination from a player, that's the end of Guttman, isn't it? He would just quit at that point. He has that. It's very much his way or the highway.
That was a Kispest. He tried to get this. He tried to pull this player off the field at a time when there was no substitutes.
We'll be better off with 10.
And Puskás overruled him, and so he left. And at this point, Eastern Europe was falling under Soviet control because, after the Second World War, there was also that.
Yes.
So Eastern Europe was falling, behind the Iron Curtain, and there were new purges beginning. And the first European show trial, as opposed to, in Russia, was in Hungary, and it focused on a Zionist spy ring. So, this is what I mean, the kind of post-Second World War environment. The Soviets weren't exactly going to say, I'll come in here and have a look at all of the history books and stuff, let's have a look at the records. That's not really how they operated. So that was it. On this occasion, he upped sticks and he left. At this point, he essentially becomes stateless. And later he gets Austrian citizenship, but he leaves and he doesn't return. There's quite a remarkable little kind of wrinkle to his time as coach of Benfica when they're playing in the European Cups that they won. And they go back to play against Újpest in the European Cup, but he wouldn't return because he was afraid that if he went back to the country, he wouldn't be allowed to leave.
Yeah.
But anyway, one of his old buddies, another Jewish Hungarian coach, Erno Egri, who had been in a labor camp, and he was one of the guys that escaped with Guttman. he had been a famous coach before the war, and he'd coached in Italy, and he'd gone back. So Guttman moved to Italy in 1949. So 50 Hungarian coaches had worked in Italy in the years between the two wars, a lot of whom were Jewish. One guy, Arpad Weiss, won the league with Inter in 1930, a Hungarian Jew, and was later killed in Auschwitz after his wife, 12-year-old son, and 8-year-old daughter had been killed as well. Like I say, this stuff is all throughout the book. This is not a fun book, but it does a brilliant job at not just kind of telling you about this Jewish history, but it also just, memorializes these people who did amazing things and met such grisly, horrible ends,
Well, as the author says, there was 4 or 5 characters in this book who would justify their very own books for so many interesting stories, so many stories of daring do and bravery for not just themselves but their compatriots.
Okay, well, I know we're getting towards the football stuff, but so he moves to Italy, to Vienna. He was in Vienna, where the Jewish population had gone from 185,000 before the war to 9,000 after the war. And then he goes to Padua, which is near Venice. So in Padua, 85 Jews had been dragged to their deaths on cobbled streets 5 years before Guttman got there. So yeah, everywhere he went, I guess there was this legacy and this history. Yeah, so he went through this kind of series of small teams. They would start really well, go up to second or third in the league, and then they kind of run out of steam. What they used to say about, was it Pochettino's teams they used to always say that about?
Well, I think a good one now is Postecoglou, right? Well, this has not been mentioned. He trained twice a day when the conventional wisdom was only once, and he was huge on diet and nutrition as well, in a way that no other coaches were and would be for another 50 years, frankly. So in that sense, he was really ahead of his time, but obviously that got some of the players offside as well. And so his teams would burn out. They'd get knackered towards the end of the season and drop off, which I guess is, similar to what people accuse Postecoglou of at the moment, just overtraining.
He was also accused of bringing in a terrible goalkeeper when he was at Padua, so he could get a nice little kickback for himself. But he says that was just a kind of a pretext to get him fired. And he was investigated, but he was found innocent. But that was the end of his time at Padua, obviously. And he went on to Union Tristina on the border with present-day Slovenia, the city where James Joyce is said to have met Italo Svevo, who inspired the character of Leopold Bloom in Ulysses.
Yeah, I'm rereading Ulysses at the moment, loving it.
I'm on page 8, man. I'm fucking getting through that thing.
I'm on sentence 8, and that's as far as I've ever got. Well, because sentence 8 finishes on page fucking 300, doesn't it? Tristina there, another short period. He never lasts more than 3 years at any club ever, at any point during his career. He really is a short, sharp shock operator, and he's continually likened to Mourinho in that. But it is in Italy that he gets his big break. He gets the AC Milan job.
But wait, Al, it's not before he goes to Argentina. And this is where he got the job from Herschel, the one-time kosher butcher from Budapest, who had blagged his way onto the Haka All-Star tour in Brazil in 1930, claiming to be a masseur. And then that guy went to manage a club called Gymnasia. And there he went on to River Plate, where he won the league twice in the 30s, before going to Uruguay and winning the league with Penarol. At some point changing his name along the way. He's changed his name a few times. He encourages Guttman to come over because there's a team called San Lorenzo, because Herschel was managing the San Lorenzo. But he was sick and he said, come over, we need another manager. And by the time he'd taken the sea liner to South America, San Lorenzo had already found a new manager. Sorry, Béla.
Yeah, okay. And you're right, there's another team in there as well, Quilmes.
Yeah, a second division team in Argentina.
Ooh. Okay, and then yeah, you're quite right.
He went to Cyprus?
Yeah, he went to Cyprus, Apoel Nicosia. Of course he went to Cyprus. Who wouldn't?
Yeah. Yes, and
Yes,
then came the
and
big
then
break.
he
So
got the big.
you're only about 4 clubs off, huh?
It's a lot of fucking teams in here, Johnny. It's a lot to take in. Yeah, right. Well, I can tell you something about AC Milan. Who did he sign at AC Milan? Cesare Maldini, thus beginning one of the sexiest dynasties in football.
He got the team to the top of the league, and then he just fucked off before they won it.
Yeah, he does.
Well, what happened was he ended up his friend was Sessler, who was the manager of Sampdoria, another Jewish friend, and they were in Genoa, I think, because Milan were playing Sampdoria, and they went out for a night out, the two managers and their wives, and the two men got into a fist fight, and then one of the wives, he didn't say which one, tried to bottle someone or threw a bottle, and then yeah, he ended up kind of getting bundled out of Milan, but he thinks that this guy Sessler, who was kind of a powerful coach, conspired to get rid of Guttman out of Milan. But Milan did win the league with his team essentially.
Something else happened in 1955 in Milan, and Béla Guttman killed a man, a 17-year-old bicyclist, in a car, and then fled.
Yeah.
And this is the one part of the book where I was going, because I believe the author really does try to defend him a bit, going, oh, well, after, and maybe it's true, but after like the self-preservation through the Second World War and the horrors, that would have been his instinct to try and survive. I don't know. It was a strange one.
Yeah, so what happened was he was driving his friend's car and he crashed into two fellas who were on the side of the road, two students, killing this 17-year-old Giuliano Brene. But the story is quite remarkable, isn't it? Because the guy who owned the car and who was in the passenger seat was a guy called Dezo Solti, another Hungarian Jew. And this guy had been in Auschwitz and had been a personal assistant of sort, or kind of a runner of Joseph Mengele. 49 members of this guy's family were killed in Auschwitz, although he managed to save one of his nieces. But this is not what made, this guy is famous because in the 70s, he was involved in a huge bribery scandal where he was a kind of a go-between who was bribing referees on behalf of the biggest clubs in Italy. So this is the guy who owned the car and was in the car. And not only that, so the two of them fled and they both went in different directions. Solti was caught up with him in somewhere like Switzerland, right? He was arrested and he was brought back to Italy.
Yeah.
And he said it was him. I was the one driving the car. And they were both charged with manslaughter. At this time, Guttman was the coach of Vicenza. By the time they were charged was in 1955, but by the time the trial came around was 1957. At this time, Guttman was in South America. See you later, Italy. He was gone.
The wheels turned very slowly. They said they couldn't find this Dezo Solti, although he was a very famous man existing in Italy at that time with a very famous company. But eventually, he is found guilty of manslaughter, charged with 6 months in prison, but managed to get out of it by paying half a year's salary to the victims' families.
Yeah. And the author does say that they probably bribed the judge. Solti is a professional briber at the end of the day.
Yes. Best in the business.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an astonishing. I mean, he is an astonishing character, right? I mean, literally assistant to history's greatest monster.
These guys obviously led tragic lives, but they lived crazy lives as well, didn't they?
Unbelievable lives. The names that pop up in this book, from Joseph Mengele to Ian Dowie, it's wild.
Yeah, Himmler and Gary Bartels. Is this the only book you reckon that mentions Himmler and Gary Bartels?
I'm going to say yes, Johnny.
Yeah, I would imagine so. So where are we now? This is 1957. He's off to South America.
Milan to Vicenza to Honved to Sao Paulo.
Yeah.
For a year. Off to Porto for a year. And then in 59, he's clear of the manslaughter charge. This is when he goes to Benfica, and this is when he reaches the public's consciousness. In fact, there's a statue of Béla Guttman at Benfica.
Yeah.
With his two 2 European Cups. And this is coming straight off the back of when Real Madrid were absolutely dominant, the famous 5 in a row.
And the first 5 European Cups as well.
Yeah, exactly. The likes Di Stefano and Puskás up front.
How about this guy, right? So he goes to Benfica, as you say, right? And at the time, you weren't allowed to play foreign players. But players from Angola and from Mozambique were counted as Portuguese. And there's this one guy called, this was remarkable, I thought, Jose Aguas, however you say it, who was, I looked him up, he was from a Portuguese family and they were living in Angola, like colonialists or whatever. And he was a hunter and he'd never played football. And Benfica came to town for a friendly and he was known for his athleticism. So they said, why don't you just play in the game? And Benfica said, okay, we're signing that guy. And that guy became like a legend of Benfica, won the European Cup. Isn't that? No, that really is amazing.
That's it. They should be out scouting hunters, eh? It made sense in the book. When I read it, it's like, oh yeah, I pictured him in my head, little lithe hunter, like hunting down those squirrels or something, fast and nippy. He'd be good at football, wouldn't he? Yeah, so yeah, he gets this Aguas guy who is an absolute revelation, and there's the small matter of a little lad called Eusebio as well.
That was nice. So Eusebio's from Mozambique, and he was picked up by Benfica, even though he was playing for a team that was a Sporting Lisbon feeder club. Ouch.
Yeah. I mean, Guttman was instrumental in that. Yeah, so Sporting must have been absolutely furious.
My parents are gone to a little town in Portugal this very day called Lagos. And Eusebio was hidden away in a house in Lagos so that by Benfica, so Sporting couldn't find him and try and convince him to jump ship to Sporting. It's a nice little story, isn't it? They'd gone to his house in Mozambique and plopped a load of cash onto his table and said, come on, man, you got to play for us. And he said, look, I can't sign 2 contracts. So they had to hide him.
That's cool, isn't it?
Yeah, that is nice.
He wins every European Cup he possibly can. He wins everything he can do when he's at Benfica. Everything comes together. All his wiles and achievements are finally realised.
In their first European Cup, they beat Barcelona, a team with 3 Hungarians. And this was actually a rare occasion in reading these books where the game came alive a bit in the book. So it was 3-2. But it was also back at the Wankdorf Stadium, Al. Remember the Wankdorf Stadium in Bern?
Certainly do.
And 2 of the Hungarians who played for Barcelona had played there in the 1954 World Cup final, defeat to West Germany. Jesus, they must hate the Wankdorf Stadium in Bern.
Yeah, no kidding.
And then they had to play against Real Madrid. They played this against Spurs in the semi-final the year they beat Real Madrid. But this was when Eusebio wasn't around for the first European Cup, but he was around for the second one, and that was their Eusebio show. Can I read something to you? You know, like the high-performance podcasts and the high-performance books and those kinds of things, where you're just trying to get close. What is this special sauce? The je ne sais quoi. So what was it about Guttman? What was his X factor? In the final against Real Madrid, they went in at halftime 2-0 down. And then cue a rousing speech from Guttman to his Benfica team. The speech was half in Portuguese, half in Italian. And this is the speech in full. Mr. Sit down. Mr. Sit down. Real Madrid tired. Real Madrid tired. Real Madrid old. 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 They cannot win. Real Madrid cannot run. Di Stefano dead. That was the speech. And the guy who recounted it, this player, Antonio Samoas. That moment really struck us.
Yeah.
What? I guess it's how you tell him, eh?
Yeah. Any translation of anything he ever says is so hideous. The translators are so difficult to read. It's so weird. All of the translation, they're very strange. So
we're up to 1962 now, is it? It's like 61, 62, and 62, 63. Is that when they won the European Cups?
Yeah, 62.
But if you think you can get away from the Second World War, Al, the ref in that final against Real Madrid, which they won 5-3, by the way. Eusebio scored 2 goals in the second half. There was a ref, he was a Jewish ref called Leo Horn, a hero of the Dutch resistance who was hiding Jews in the Netherlands during the war. And he was going under the fake name Dr. Van Dongen. In 1945, this man held up a German munitions wagon, leaving 10 soldiers gagged and bound, and just fucked off. And I was reading this elsewhere. He dressed in a white coat, wearing a stethoscope, and smuggled a key resistance fighter into a hospital to hide him from the Gestapo. Like, that is pretty fucking amazing stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it's great.
Do you think after this, so, he's won the European Cup 2 years on the bounce. He wants more money, and this is a constant throughout his career. The author says that managers weren't really getting paid enough, but he was always looking for more money. So he said to Benfica he wanted more money, and they weren't really willing to pay because I guess they didn't think he'd leave. But leave he did, and 2 teams came in for them. Who are they, Al? They both began with P.
Penarol and Port Vale.
Port Vale, yeah. Third division, Port Vale.
There's some chutzpah, eh? Why not? Have a go, Port Vale.
Yeah. Yeah, he never really got it back then, did he?
No, the only success he had in South America was with Sao Paulo, where he won the Campeonato Paulista, the regional championship.
Yeah, like the kind of rest of Guttman's career is he goes to places, he flames out. He becomes the Austrian national coach and he accuses them of being racist and anti-Semitic. And this is not an accusation that he ever used in any other part of his life. So I tend to believe him.
Yeah, so the money thing is something that followed him around. And this is also part of the ugly cliches about being the Jew. That he was always money grabbing.
Yeah, exactly.
But in fact, David Bolchover explains that in fact he probably had a big gambling addiction.
And his wife as well.
And his wife, who died in an unmarked grave, right? Well, she didn't die in an unmarked grave, it was put in an unmarked grave. I've jumped ahead there. But yeah, he had a big gambling thing, and it was always the money thing. And that's, something you could throw at a Jewish person in the history, like money hungry.
Yeah, exactly. There's kind of an old Jewish trope, I suppose. And maybe he was being accused of being money grabbing when others wouldn't have been. You just don't know, right? And as you say, he also seems to have had this deep and long-standing chronic gambling problem. But he goes back to Benfica, and all the players who used to be totally enthralled to him, they continued to get to European finals and were winning leagues, and they were rich. And this pissed Guttman off because they had kind of grown fat on the success that he had created, and he felt like he didn't get any credit for it. So they were just not interested, and he fell out with players very quickly. He fell out with Eusebio, who he was calling kind of entitled and lazy and stuff like that. And this is when he put a curse, he put a hex on them.
And that's the most famous thing about Béla Guttman, the curse of Benfica. Since winning the European Cup in 1962, Benfica have played in 8 European finals and won none of them. And he does his maths here, and this is all nonsense, right? But there's a 1 in 256 chance of you have it going into 8 games and losing all of them, all things being equal. Well, that's obviously bollocks. And not only that, the thing he is most famous for, the curse of Benfica, David Bolchover, the author, says there is just no record of whatsoever in any way. It's completely fabricated. And again, a curse would be some sort of mystic thing that you'd throw at a Jewish person.
A demonic Jew is
a demonic Jew, yeah.
Is kind of another trope. He does, however, say that given Guttman's character, he would be surprised if he hadn't said something like that to them when he was leaving.
Well, that's true, yes. And he said, given Guttman's character, he'd expect it to be longer than a curse for 100 years as well.
That was nice enough, I thought. But yeah, that's the kind of he kind of bounces around for a while there. He goes to Switzerland. He manages my local team, Servette in Geneva.
Yeah, Servette. Greece, he goes Panathinaikos. He goes back to Vienna. But by this time, he's a very old man. He's 63 when he wins the Champions League. He wins the European Cup. His last job is with Porto, his great nemesis. But by this time, he's 75 years old and he's absolutely terrible and does an awful job and is sacked.
Yeah, and then he kind of died. Him and his wife didn't have kids. He died before her, and when she died, she was essentially penniless, right? She was in debt actually. And this is kind of where the author talks about this possible
The gambling.
the gambling thing, exactly. Yeah.
Well, that's it. The author says he goes looking for Marianne Gutman's grave, but he can't find it. And in fact, it had been marked with a little wooden cross, which had long since eroded away. So there she lays, unheralded.
And also,
Yeah,
not
grim
him.
and gloomy end.
Yeah.
It's a grim and gloomy book.
Well, you say it's grim and gloomy, and it is obviously it's not poolside reading, but it's interesting. If you want, people obviously go in for heavy books, and it is a good book. It's just a very heavy book.
No, it's an excellent book, Johnny, and I just don't really expose myself to this stuff anymore. Like, I remember being in my 20s, I would read to improve myself, but as I get older, Johnny, I just read for pleasure, and I'm not really exposed to this. But it is a decent reminder, isn't it, of Jesus, man's inhumanity's a man, which is just always bubbling along, isn't it, bruv? Yeah, so what do you think he was like, Johnny? I mean, do you think he was a good guy?
Well, I assume he was an egomaniac, and kind of a visionary egomaniac, and maybe it's hard to be one without being the other. He's obviously prickly, he's obviously difficult and combustible and getting into fights and falling out with people all of the time. Like that guy that he had the fight with in the bar in Genoa was one of the guys who would kind of help getting jobs in Italy in the first place, and they're just out for dinner and he ends up like, have you ever been out for dinner with a friend and ended up for dinner now? Just like you and your wife and your friend and his wife and just ended up in a fist fight with them? Doesn't happen to most people, I think.
I can remember when my friend Julian said Nirvana were commercial. I think I pushed him. But
he deserved it.
On a night out. Yeah, I mean, that's it. He was intensely charismatic, right? And he made connections wherever he went. That's what gave him the opportunity to move to South America, because of all the people he met when he went on these tours. So the man was obviously bursting with charisma. And as you say, a football visionary. But it's difficult to know his character. He does seem, as you say, very prickly.
The author says that in maybe 2013 or something, there was a survey of 75 football experts for whatever to vote this and that, and Gutman was voted the 9th most influential coach, which, when you think about it, I think that's one of the things where, when there's Q does the best albums and it's always Astral Weeks.
Yeah.
Like, I love Astral Weeks myself, but it's just one of those things that you say if you want to sound cool. Like, a lot of those guys were talking shit when they say Gutman is the best, like, to get him up to 9th, because nobody knows a fucking thing about him.
No, nobody does know a thing. And the thing that everyone thinks they know about him turned out to be rubbish.
Yeah, so, like, even then, so his name, yeah, maybe he's the kind of hipster choice now for who's the most influential coach. Well, I would have to say Béla Guttman, hipster's choice, maybe.
Yeah, I think it is a hipster's choice. But equally, as I say, the 1958 Brazil manager, I credited him with, like, revolutioning the game.
No, I'm not questioning that he was brilliant at what he did. I'm just saying that people are full of shit saying that they remember anything about it, because there's no way anyone does.
No, who did he ask? Like, Scott Parker, who's the most influential? I've got to say, Béla Guttman. It was, quite a book.
It's so different than any of the other books that we've done, obviously.
Yeah, this is a difficult one because, again, it wasn't a joy to read, but as you say, I've learned more about this and been depressed more than any book since Milner's. Yeah, so I'm going to give that 4 Béla Guttman's Curses out of 5, Johnny. It's an excellent book.
Yeah, like, I think it's an excellent book, and it depends on what people are looking for. And I guess most people, like maybe some people who listen to a football book podcast, this is not what they're looking for. But I thought it was excellent, and I thought it was really interesting in a very, very depressing way. It was well written. It was, such a vast kind of sweep to this book. It covers so many things, really. Like it covered an incredible life. As you say, Guttman himself is not, we don't learn all that much about him as an individual, but then we do learn an incredible amount about the Jewish experience in Europe. And by God, is it a bad experience? So I would say 3.5 or 4. I'll give it 4 Béla Guttman curses out of 5.
Yeah, it's a serious book about a very serious topic. Yeah, and it's not as easy to have fun with this one, but as you say, this is the book I've learned most from.
In keeping with the seriousness, next is who?
Yeah. In a change of pace, the next book we're doing is In Search of Duncan Ferguson by Jan Patullo. This should be a slightly easier read.
I suspect it might be a bit different. Well, there will be a bit of sectarianism in there, I suppose,
Yeah, it'll be a fun read unless you're a burglar who broke into Duncan Ferguson's house. Not so fun then.
Thank you very much, Al. Next week, we will have our next Adamola Buckman injury time, in which we are selecting
a prison 5-a-side.
Yes, the whole 5 yards.
Yeah, very nicely done.
Oh, thank you very much.
And we'll be back in 2 weeks with In Search of Duncan Ferguson. Yeah, a more light-hearted read, one would hope.
One would suspect. Thanks very much, Al.
Yeah, thank you, Johnny. And we'll see you all next week.
Let your body spin like there is nothing in life but dancing. I can't keep my hands off you, as if this looked like glue.